Well, good morning. Good morning, ladies and gentlemen. I'm Morton Blackwell, president of the Leadership Institute, and it is my pleasure to welcome you to this Wednesday Wake Up Club breakfast. We live in interesting times. I noticed a story in today's Washington Times about one Zacharias Moussaoui, who is the so-called 20th hijacker, and his antics before a court where he is on trial, and I guess he's on trial for his life. The newspaper also this morning has another story about the 5 Al-Qaeda terrorists who were killed, I guess, yesterday in Afghanistan, near the Pakistan border, killed by U.S. forces. Well, I don't know if you heard the story about what happened to the September 11th hijackers. After they killed themselves and so many other people, the 19 of them went up to the pearly gates and knocked on the door, and St. Peter came out and said, "What can I do for you?" And they said, "Well, we've been promised 72 virgins." And he said, "Well, just y'all step over there." And then out of the pearly gates comes George Washington and several of his Continental Army people with sabers, and they slash up these 19 terrorists and go back in, and then out comes Thomas Jefferson with several of his friends, and they have fowling pieces with birdshot, and they shoot the guns into these terrorists, and then they go back in, and Robert E. Lee comes out with a number of his people, and they have pistols, and they shoot them, empty their pistols into them, and then go back in, and then out comes General Jeb Stuart with several of his people on horseback, and they take their sabers and they slash them and then trample them with their horses, and they go back in, and then out comes General George Patton with several of his people in tanks, and they roll over these folks, crushing them, and they go back into the pearly gates. Well, one of the terrorists, still able to talk, asks St. Peter, he said, "How could this happen? You know, we were promised 72 virgins." And St. Peter said, you Mohammedans are going to have to learn how to spell. You were promised 72 Virginians."
Everything always loses.
Everything loses in translation, right. In 2002, thus far this year, the Leadership Institute has trained 1,012 students in 39 of our schools, and we placed 17 job seekers in public policy positions around the country through our employment placement service. And you have before you this goldenrod colored piece of paper, which is our 2002 current school schedule, and I'd ask that you take a moment and review the schedule of schools in that calendar and consider attending one or more of our programs, or consider recommending people to our schools. Now my responsibility is to introduce Rich Westfall, who will give us our invocation and pledge of allegiance. Rich is the Director of Graduate Development for the Leadership Institute Center for Print and Broadcast Media. Rich provides career assistance to Leadership Institute graduates and other referrals of people who aspire to work in the media. In addition to maintaining our free placement service for media professionals, Rich tries to keep up with over 2,000 graduates of our media training. Prior to working here at the Institute, Rich served in various capacities for USA Radio Network, America's Voice, and the Free Congress Foundation. No left-wing groups there. And Rich is an alumnus of Ashland University in Ohio, where he studied broadcast technology and public affairs. Rich Westfall.
Please join me in prayer. Most gracious God and Heavenly Father, we come before you today asking the spirit of humility be released in us. We recognize our dependence on you for every heartbeat and every breath we take. We acknowledge how easy it is for us to go wayward and become idolatrous. We often seek the temporary gain of this life over the eternal purpose you give us. Have mercy on us. We ask that you would grant direction to those who are in positions of authority and public service. May your wisdom be with those that lead this country. We ask that you make their hearts attentive to the spirit of truth so that they may do what is right in your sight. Let their examples illuminate a path for those they lead. Let America shine as a city on a hill. Guide us toward greater virtue and towards your perfect character so that we might be a light to the world. May your spirit unleash a more complete sense of liberty, justice, honor, sacrifice, charity, virtue, and peace. We now ask your blessing on this gathering, the food to our nourishment, the people, the conversation, the words spoken, and the action we take following this meeting. In your holy name, amen. Please join me in the pledge. I pledge allegiance to the flag of the United States of America and to the republic for which it stands, one nation, under God, indivisible, with liberty and justice for all.
Thanks, Rich. And now I introduce for our commercial interlude, Rich Moha. He's going to give us an update on our programs. He is the National Operations Director for the Campus Leadership Program here at the Institute. He joined the CLP staff in 1997, initially serving as a field representative to students on campuses throughout Virginia, Maryland, and Washington, D.C. He's a native of Colorado Springs and received his BA from Hillsdale College, a conservative school, and his MA in political science from Miami University, which is not notoriously a conservative college, but he survived well. Rich?
Good morning. As Morton said, I've been asked to give you all a quick update on the Campus Leadership Program and how we've been doing recently. I am very happy to report that we've been doing very well. For those of you unfamiliar with the Campus Leadership Program, we are the Leadership Institute's effort to launch an independent conservative student group on every single campus in America. We set these student groups up with all the tools they will need to win the cultural war going on at their schools. We set them up as their own charitable organizations with the Internal Revenue Service. We provide them the training necessary to get them the funding necessary to run their programs. Then we teach them how to bring speakers into their campus, how to print their own student newspapers, how to win student government elections, and in general just cause the liberals on their campus a little bit more pain. Our Campus Leadership Program groups were at the forefront of the pro-America movement after the September 11th attacks. They staged pro-America rallies at Berkeley, California. They forced professors to apologize for anti-American remarks said in class at the University of Mexico. They kept the nation informed about what was going on our campuses. And they exposed their campuses to speakers who would otherwise not have been invited to address the students. They made sure that the utterly ridiculous things the liberals said and did were exposed to the national media, and they made sure that American-loving students were not shut out or silenced from their debate. Since then, the ranks of conservative activists on college campuses have continued to grow. There are now 239 active Campus Leadership Program groups making a difference on their college campuses. In the past 2 months, Campus Leadership Program groups have hosted speakers like Ed Bloom, David Horowitz, Reginald Jones, Nesh D'Souza, Ann Coulter, just to name a few. These speakers offer a balance to the invariable liberal speakers brought to the campuses by the official school administration. Our student groups also continue to launch new independent conservative papers on their campuses. We know these papers are doing their job of spreading the conservative message because the liberals have been trying so hard to shut them down. This semester alone, 4 Campus Leadership Program group papers have been stolen, burned, or defunded by leftists. However, thanks to the Campus Leadership Program and the generous donors who support us, students at the University of Florida, Arizona State, University of California, Berkeley, and Bates College are still printing their papers and getting that message out to the masses. As the director of the Campus Leadership Program, it is my privilege to work with hundreds of conservative students across the country. And though I am still disappointed at how the leftists continue to try to censor them, I am very happy that so many more students are willing to stand up for what they believe in. There are so many good things going on college campuses today, thanks in large part to the Students Leadership the Leadership Institute works with. But our job is still far from done. The conservatives need to do more to stand up to the liberals' wrong-headed ideas on college campuses. Because if we don't, students will go through their entire education without ever hearing anything but the liberal line being forced down their throats by school administrators. It's just plain wrong that liberal professors are allowed to spout off their own repugnant, unsubstantiated, often anti-American views in class and get away with it in the name of academic freedom, even if there's absolutely no educational value in them. And then these same professors try to deny conservative students a forum at their school because some ideas might be, quote, too dangerous for everyone to hear. These are the sorts of things the Campus Leadership Program was created to make sure stop happening. We look forward to continuing to give students the opportunity and knowledge to become leaders on their campus and in their communities. And we anticipate the day when every college campus in America has a conservative organization telling students the truth they are currently being denied. In the coming months, we will be continuing to expand this program onto new campuses. One of the areas we are particularly targeting right now is California. This weekend, we will host a youth leadership school in San Diego, where we plan to have 8 to 10 schools represented. The students at the school will not only gain the knowledge and skills they can only get at Morton's boot camp of politics, but they will also be told by Campus Leadership Program staff how they can start their own dynamic student groups, print their own efficient student papers, and become student leaders. I hope to be sharing our success in California at a future breakfast, but until then, I just want to thank you all for your continued support and assure you that we will continue to give conservative students a chance to make a difference on their campuses. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Rich. And to introduce our speaker, I present to you Tom Crow. He is originally from Youngstown, Ohio. He graduated in the year 2000 from Mount Union College, where he studied political science and Spanish. And he joined the Institute here in February of last year. He currently serves as the Director of Recruitment and Marketing for the Center for Print and Broadcast Media. He is responsible for the Center's Broadcast Journalism School and the Effective Television Techniques Workshops, plural. We have 4 levels of them. Tom is also co-editor of The College Briefing, which is our relatively new weekly email digest, which exposes outrageous campus leftist official publication journalism in their own words. And I urge you, if you are interested, to get it. It's a free email digest, and give us your email address, or give Tom your email address, and he'll be happy to get you on this. I review this every time before it goes out, and maybe punch up the headlines a little bit, but they do a great job of getting really outrageous stuff that's being officially published on college campuses. Tom Crow.
I feel like I should be giving the speech with that introduction, but I certainly don't have the resume to do so just yet, maybe in a few years. Our speaker this morning, though, definitely does have the resume to give the Wednesday Wake Up Club breakfast speech this morning. Ambassador Lichenstein, as it says in your program, is currently a distinguished fellow over at the Heritage Institute. Before that, he was alternate U.S. representative to the United Nations for Special Political Affairs under President Reagan, and you can read that yourself. I heard a couple of things from somebody who works over at Heritage, and I know that maybe he can elaborate on. One of them has something to do with Barry Goldwater, who ran for president a few years back. Some of you may remember him. He gave a speech in which he mentioned extremism in the pursuits of liberty is no vice, et cetera, et cetera. I don't remember the entire thing because I'm not a very good person. And I heard that Ambassador Lichenstein may have written that speech or had something to do with it. And I also heard that when he taught at Yale, he had this skinny kid from California come out and be in one of his courses, and that skinny kid from California turned out to be Edwin Meese. So I'm sure he's got some great stories. Ambassador Lichenstein.
Yeah, Ed,
there just wasn't anything to Ed. He was straight up and down, and if you got him in a certain light, you couldn't even see him anymore. But he grew in wisdom and pounds and more pounds and I hope more wisdom. And it's been great to have this extended reunion with Ed, beginning, of course, when he was Attorney General, and, of course, before that, when he was one of the tripartite chiefs of staff at the White House during the first Reagan administration. Some of you out there, like me, are just barely old enough to remember the first Reagan administration. The Goldwater story isn't quite as good as has been indicated. That speech, the acceptance speech at the 1964 convention in San Francisco, was probably the only good committee-written speech that I have ever had anything to do with, but that, of course, was a consequence of the excellence of the committee that wrote it. And I was one of the committee. Dick Ware, who some of you may know, who's run the Realm and Earhart Foundations for many, many years, and during the Nixon administration served with Mel Laird as an Assistant Secretary of Defense, was another of the members of the team. Warren Nutter, distinguished economist from the University of Virginia, who, had he not tragically died quite young, would, I think, have shared the Nobel Prize with Jim Buchanan, because he, as much as Jim, invented the public choice school of economics. Milton Friedman, whom some of you have heard of, and Harry Jaffa, probably the most distinguished living American historian of the Civil War period. And Harry at that time was a professor of political science at Ohio State University. We received from Carl Hess, who was sort of our chief speechwriter for the senator, we received a draft, good one, but it didn't have any of the zingers in it that have since made the speech famous. And one of those zingers had to do, of course, with a play on the then controversy over what did we mean by extremism, and what about the charge that extremists were in charge of the Goldwater campaign. As a matter of fact, we were, and we were extremely a lot of things. We were extremely patriotic, and we were extremely intelligent, and we were extremely devoted to the principles of the Republican Party, and we were devoted to Senator Goldwater personally. Harry said that he was certain that he remembered from his Cicero a juxtaposition of extremism in the defense of liberty, and contrasted with moderation in the pursuit of justice. And we all thought that that would make for an excellent one-liner. Little did we know. And could he please dig up the quote for us? He called his son, who was sitting out in Columbus, Ohio. I remember the conversation very clearly, because he sort of said, no, it's the second shelf above my desk. I mean, it was as if he was visualizing, and he had his son over there on the other end of the phone line, and yeah, the second shelf above my desk. No, you're going too far left. about 4 or 5 or 6 books to the left of the center line, and there you will find an annotated copy, my annotated copy of Cicero, and it was in Latin. And pull it down from the shelf, if you please. And his son, I think that this is something you're hearing for the first time. His son, as best I could reconstruct it, read out the quotation to Harry in Latin, and Harry translated it, fortunately, for us. My Latin was very rusty, and it went downhill from there with respect to the committee whose membership I've mentioned to you. So that's the story. I did not invent the line. I did not come up with the line. Harry did. We all thought it was a splendid line, and we all share proudly a footnote in history, which ain't bad for one afternoon's work in San Francisco. And the senator, by the way, was absolutely delighted with the speech, would not have a word of it changed, and I thought delivered it with a remarkable and admirable address, and wowed that part of the convention that was pro-Cold Water and infuriated that part of the convention which was anti-Cold Water, which I suppose also was part of our strategy. Let me simply lay out 2 or 3 major principles that I think have special relevance to the articulation and the pursuit of U.S. foreign policy, and I'll elaborate on each of them only very briefly, and then, if I may, invite comments and questions from you, because I think you know better than I do what genuinely interests you out there in the world, on which I might throw a bit of light. The first principle I am reminded of because of the way President George W. Bush embarked on his presidency. And almost as soon as he did so, he became the focus of intense criticism because he was shifting the United States from a multi to a unilateral approach, by which, of course, his critics meant taking only or principally the United States into consideration in determining those policies that would serve our best interests. And what, of course, is very interesting about all of this, for someone like myself who served for 3.5 years as a U.S. representative to the United Nations, is, of course, that every country in the world pursues its own national interest. But somehow or other, the United States is not supposed to. The United States is supposed to pursue some interest higher than, or other than, or an interest of its own which is inclusive of the interest of other countries. Well, I think we have to shake ourselves loose. I'm not speaking to you personally because I sense that you don't disagree with what you think I'm about to say. But we as Americans, this country, has to shake itself loose from the notion that there is something to be apologized for. There is something shameful about the pursuit of one's own national interest. Unilateralism simply means the first decision you make about foreign policy is what will be of greatest service to the United States of America. And to do so unapologetically and without shame and unabashedly. Why shouldn't we pursue our goals? Why else are we in an international, quote, community, unquote, except to pursue as best we can, and with least pain to others, and without intruding on the interest of others to the extent possible, our own interests. All decision-making begins by being unilateral. There is no other way to make a decision except by first of all asking yourself, what do I want? What am I pursuing? What is my purpose? Then sometimes one discovers that there are other people out there and other countries out there that sufficiently share, not perfectly, not in every detail, but sufficiently share those purposes that useful and productive associations can be entered into with those countries, and then you turn to what is called multilateralism. This is the way we used to conduct our trade relationships. We had a term called bilateral trade agreements, and the United States entered into agreements with other countries as other countries expressed the interest of entering into agreements with us about tariffs, trade, and maximum possible freedom of commerce across international borders. This has now become the World Trade Organization, which I happen to be somewhat still skeptical of. It has become a huge multilateral organization in which I think actually it is becoming more rather than less difficult to enter into useful trading relationships, because the likelihood that all of the participating countries will want to enter into the same kinds of relationships with each other, it seems to me, is very, very unlikely indeed. I would somewhere find myself between the purely bilateral approach and the hugely multilateral approach. But the first principle I wanted to mention was that all decision-making in foreign policy, as in every other area of policy, begins as a unilateral decision. It begins as an American decision. It begins as a decision perfectly openly in answer to the question, what will best fulfill the predominant interests of the United States of America? The second principle follows, of course, directly from the first, and that is, to the extent possible in foreign affairs, we should tell the truth. Now, telling the truth in the political world is sometimes looked at askance. I'll tell you a small story. It happened at the very end of the Nixon administration, about a week before the president resigned, and about a week before President Ford assumed office. What was that? August of 74. I was in the White House. I was a special assistant to the president. And I sat in, as did all of the more senior members of the staff, on a briefing with the then Chief of Staff of the White House, whose name was Al Haig. And Al Haig, in the course of his remarks, referred in two successive sentences to Henry Kissinger and Rasputin. Now, Rasputin, as you, I'm sure, all recall, was a somewhat mysterious and ill-favored monk who scurried around the Tsar's palace in the late days of the Romanov regime of Russia, shortly before the Bolshevik Revolution. Rasputin has not had a very good reputation over the years. Rasputin has actually been accused of being devious. Rasputin has accused of being quite mad. I thought it was very interesting that Al saw fit to say something about Henry's role at the White House, and then immediately his mind went to Rasputin. And I put it aside. I mean, I'm not a suspicious fellow by nature, and I thought that that just was one of those flashes of inspiration, and that if anybody was interested in it, they'd better ask Al Haig about it. I received a phone call about 2 minutes after I returned to my desk, and it was from a senior reporter of the Washington Post. "Were you at the briefing?" I said, "Sure, I was at the briefing." "Will you confirm that Secretary Haig, that Chief of Staff Haig, General Haig, made a reference to Henry Kissinger that seemed to compare and contrast him, whether favorably or unfavorably, to Rasputin?" And I said, "Well, you know me perfectly well. I'm not going to have any comment on that. I don't know whether he made such a comment. If I knew, I wouldn't tell you. My understanding was the briefing was off the record, and it was for the benefit of those of us who serve the President of the United States." End of conversation. About 2 minutes after that, I received a phone call from the then press secretary, who by this time was Ron Nessen, who had taken over from Ron Ziegler. And Ron called me and he said, why did you stiff Wally at the Washington Post? And I said, "Well, what do you expect me to do? I'm not going to confirm or deny such a report." "Well," he said, "you could do it off the record." I said, "I don't do interviews off the record. I do them on the record." He said, "Really? You do all of your interviews, even with the members of the Washington Post, on the record?" And I said, "Yes." He said, "Well, how do you ever remember what you say from interview to interview?" And I said, "Well, I tell them the truth. And I assume that the truth does not vary that much. It doesn't change that much." Well, he said, "That's the most remarkable thing I've ever heard." The end of the story, of course, is that Al was the source of the story. And I was told that by impeccable and unimpeachable sources. And he simply suggested that the Washington Post fulfill its serious journalistic mandate of having at least one, if not two, independent confirmations for all explosive material, and so that was the consequence of the call. That was the reason for the call. I asked Ron later on, "Did you recommend me or a number of other people who were at the briefing, or did you recommend mainly me?" And he said, "Well, I sort of thought you'd be a good source, but I didn't know," he went on to say, "I didn't know about your peculiar policy with regard to off-the-record interviews and the operations of honesty." In the field of foreign affairs, it is never possible to be absolutely honest. But one of the virtues of the George W. Bush presidency from the very first moment was, as he affirmed his lack of apology for being a unilateralist, he also began telling the truth. And his first way of telling the truth was to depart from the Kyoto Convention. As you will recall, the Clinton administration had kind of entered into the preliminaries to the agreement on limitation on greenhouse gases and other environmental protective measures undertaken under the rubric of the United Nations Conference in Rio and then in Kyoto, which is why it is called the Kyoto Protocol. Clinton never dared lay the protocol before the Senate of the United States because he knew it would be overwhelmingly rejected. Indeed, the Senate had already gone on record as being 95-0 against the principles of the Kyoto Accord. But Clinton associated the United States with that accord. George Bush had the guts to disassociate the United States by pointing out this is not a good agreement, it is not going to limit greenhouse gases, It is going to fall with unequal effect on the industrialized nations of the world, including principally the United States. It is going to fall with no effect at all on such so-called developing countries as China, and it is going to fall in a peculiar manner because of the baseline that was adopted at Kyoto. It's going to fall with a peculiar effect on such countries as Russia, which will get out from under its responsibilities because of the way the baseline was constructed, by starting to count the gases at a certain date rather than a certain other date. Russia would be, in effect, grandfathered under the Kyoto Accords and could pollute like crazy without violating the Accords. And, as George W. Bush put it, in behalf of the United States of America, we ain't going to be a party to this. He also made it clear that we were going to back out of the ABM Treaty of 1974 because it was simply being a hindrance to the development of a non-threatening defensive system against incoming missiles. And he also made it clear that the United States was going to uninitial its tentative concurrence with the principles of the International Criminal Court. Now that is, in my judgment, that is simply telling the truth. American presidents have known. Clinton knew. Clinton's predecessor knew. George Bush I, his predecessor knew that these various conventions were not going to fly. They knew that the United States of America would not associate itself formally with any or all of these conventions. George W. Bush was the first American president to say, therefore, we are not going to mislead the rest of the world into believing that we are eventually going to come round. As far as I'm concerned, that will be the day that snowballs begin to melt in hell. Now, he put it somewhat more elegantly than I have just put it, but the message he delivered, it seems to me, was a terribly important one. When I sat up at the United Nations, my principal job was to be at the Security Council. And from time to time, I received permission. Well, I'm stretching the point. I wouldn't bother to tell anybody what I was about to say, so I sort of assumed I was receiving permission. I would from time to time give some unscripted remarks at the Security Council, which tended to suggest, you know, this council is up to mischief. This council is not going to be making a contribution to world peace. This council is going to engage in something to make itself feel good, which, if anything, will have the effect of complicating situations which are already sufficiently complicated. The United States is not going to be a party to this kind of game playing, which has a terminology, as a matter of fact, up in New York. It is called UNery. And what is meant by UNery is playing the game. We, to a very great extent, and this is really the mark of the Reagan administration, particularly as reflected at the United Nations, we simply stopped playing the game, and we began, to the extent possible, telling the truth. That is a principle that has very sturdy legs, in my judgment, in the conduct of foreign policy. One of the consequences of foreign policy to be greatly avoided is to mislead both one's enemies and also one's friends, to cause them to think the United States is going to behave in a manner in which, in fact, we all know it is not going to act. And, of course, by setting a good example in this regard, to hope that other countries will also begin to stop playing the game, at which point it's conceivable that useful business can begin to be conducted. I won't say that we made radical and revolutionary strides in this regard. I will simply say that we made useful strides, and I personally was very gratified to see George W. Bush apparently taking this kind of an approach. The third principle I want to lay down is the John Quincy Adams principle, that although we are markedly in favor of the liberties of all, everywhere, we will defend, in the last analysis, only our own. We will focus on our own liberties, our own freedom, and the perpetuation of our own democracy. We hope that others do well. We wish them well. We give them our prayerful support. But as a general proposition, we will not take arms in their defense. Now, this was a principle laid down in 1823 by the then Secretary of State of the United States, later President John Quincy Adams. This might be called an extension of the George Washington doctrine of his farewell address. It is the doctrine of unless the burden of proof is on those who wish the United States to intervene. The burden of proof is on those who want the United States to become the defender of everyone else's liberties, and not just and principally of its own. That extension, it seems to me, is still alive and valid, although it is not necessarily doing very well, because we have fallen very much into the trap of getting involved everywhere indiscriminately and without clear thought to principle number one, namely, what is best for the United States of America. Or principle number two, can we actually enter into this conflict, into this potential conflict in some other part of the world, when the parties to that conflict are not telling the truth about the nature of the conflict, the origins of the conflict, or their own efforts at resolving it. I don't make this a flat, never to be accepted principle. I do not say that it is always applicable. I simply suggest that the burden of proof must always be on those who encourage the United States to involve itself where it does not absolutely have to involve itself. And there the list is a fairly short one. Clearly, we must involve ourselves when we ourselves are attacked. There can never be any question of that, and the response must be swift, and it must be devastating. And we need ask no one's permission for so responding. Indeed, we don't have to ask anybody's permission. Even the United Nations Charter allows, under Article 51, for an unlimited right of self-defense. In all other situations, the question has to be raised. How nearly does this affect the United States? How deeply do we care? And are we prepared, if it comes to it, to commit the use of our own force, of our own people, to pursue whatever the course of action is that we embark upon? And these, it seems to me, are decisions that should be made in the most grudging and the most parsimonious manner. We should not do this lightly, and we should not do this promiscuously. And we should think long and hard about whether there exists any American constituency that will support such a policy to its successful conclusion. I assume that the United States never should embark on a policy that it is not prepared to pursue to its logical conclusion. This was the only sense in which I opposed the Vietnam War. because it was impossible for an observer not to sense that our own government had given up on pursuing that war to its desired conclusion, in which case we were not only kidding the South Vietnamese and the North Vietnamese, much more seriously, we were kidding ourselves. And this was not to be permitted, and I thought that the getting out of the war was handled ham-handedly and dishonorably, because we knew where we were going, which was out, but we dared, for a variety of reasons, not say it even to ourselves, and this, it seems to me, was an unforgivable error. I don't know how far these three principles I've suggested will get us. I'm not entirely sure that I'm going to be comfortable with all of the places where it may get the United States of America, and I always reserve the right to change my mind about any and all of the principles. But for the moment, they're the ones that I kind of think about. They're the ones that I try to answer to as I look at a particular set of headlines, as I read, as I did this morning in the New York Times, that the United States and Saudi Arabia are about to embark on some deranged joint effort. A joint effort with Saudi Arabia involving terrorism seems to me more than deranged. I mean, it isn't coincidental that 15 of the 19 hijackers were Saudis. It is not coincidental that the basis for what we call Islamism or extreme Islamic fundamentalism is to be found in the Wahhabism of Saudi Arabia. It is no accident that 9 out of every $10 that goes into the coffers of terrorist organizations either originates in or passes through Saudi Arabia. It strikes me that it is going to be very difficult to pursue this joint undertaking. I'm pleased to say that there was no mention made of it in the Washington Post. So I hope that this is something that the New York Times made up overnight after too many drinks. But alas, the New York Times does have a tendency to be in on things, and so we shall simply have to hold our breaths and hope for the best. I've used up practically all of the time, but there are a few more minutes before you have to go and do something useful for the balance of the day. And so I invite a question or two, and I ask you to speak up because along with all of my years, I discover I'm developing I don't hear as well as I used to. Yes, sir.
Perhaps like you, when I was a graduate student, I was a disciple of Hans Morgenthau, and read and thought about the concept of national interest. But I was waiting to hear one other word from you, and it relates to this. The national interest as a concept is subject to interpretation. Hitler thought it was in the German national interest to annex Austria, and so on and so forth. I was waiting for the word legitimate national interest.
All national interest is legitimate.
And what does that mean?
Even Adolf Hitler's. From his perspective, that was perfectly legitimate. We happen to think he was wrong. And in the pursuit of his national interest, we could clearly see that there would be moments when the United States would find it intolerable to go along with the successful pursuit of Adolf Hitler's national interest. And finally, we went to war with Germany on this issue. But I do not use the terminology with any necessary implication that anyone but ourselves believe it to be legitimate. The U.S. national interest must always be, in our judgment, legitimate. And that's no easy question. Because does that mean only the president needs to think it legitimate? Does the president have to be joined by his Secretary of State? Or even which seems highly unlikely by his Secretary of Defense as well as his Secretary of State. I'm finding it increasingly difficult to think of any target to be pursued that would find agreement among all three of those fellows. So I'm just on the side of any of the two of them in whom I have the greatest confidence. And I shan't tell you who those two are. Or do we mean the President and Congress, or do we mean the President and the Congress and public opinion? Very difficult. By no means worked out. This is one of the great unresolved questions of the American Constitution, in my judgment. How are foreign policy decisions made? To be very precise about it, how is the decision made to commit force? The Constitution writers thought they covered it by the declaration of war, but we have now discovered that you don't declare war anymore. You make war, but you never declare it. And because you make it and don't declare it, you commit force. And because you commit force, it is under the authority of the Commander-in-Chief of the United States, who is the President of the United States. That surely is not quite what the Constitution writers had in mind. But we have not worked out the intricacies of these relationships. I don't want to argue with you about the use of the word legitimate. I simply take the liberty of saying we must always apply it to ourselves and then ask ourselves, do others in the pursuit of what they may regard as their legitimate national interest create consequences with which we feel it is impossible to live? Consequences that we will oppose, as in the case of Adolf Hitler, as in the case of Tojo and Hirohito, who made war on the United States, as in the case of Osama bin Laden, who decided, in my judgment, to make war on the United States by turning 4 airplanes into guided missiles. These are all situations that have to be looked at with the most profound care, and we must make very few unstated assumptions. We should be quite open about how we roll this out. This is one of the virtues of declaring war. You at least have some conversation in the Congress of the United States. Not very much, as it turns out. I was present. I was alive and well and paying attention by my radio to the last time that the United States ever declared war, namely its declaration of the 8th of December 1941. God knows it is not the last war in which the United States has engaged. And there wasn't really much debate, and there was only one vote cast against the declaration, as you remember, that Arkansas, that woman from Arkansas, whose name eludes me, her husband or her father had voted against the First World War, and she continued the tradition. And so it was 96 zip in the Senate, and it was 434 to 1 in the House of Representatives. And there was scant debate on the issue, but there was the occasion when there could be debate. We had been attacked, and so the question answered itself. It was useful, even though George Bush I said it was not necessary. It was useful to have an extended debate at the time of the Gulf War. And you may remember that actually those resolutions were adopted only by quite narrow margins, by only 2 or 3 or 4 or 5 votes, if I remember correctly, in the Senate. And it was a multi-day debate, and it was a good debate. It was a very good debate. I didn't listen to it, but I read it, and a lot of very shrewd and sound words were spoken. If more Americans had paid attention to it, who knows? The Americans might or might not have supported the effort that took the form of the Gulf War. But our representatives had at least the opportunity to be heard on the subject, which I think is healthy. Yes, sir.
It's becoming increasingly obvious that our problems with the Middle East and with the radical Islamists in the world go well beyond the destruction of the Al-Qaeda. If you were a White House staffer today, what advice would you have for George W. Bush?
My advice, first of all, would take the form of reopening with myself the question of how I intend to pursue the war that I declared on the 11th or 12th of September. Do I really mean an all-out war on terrorism, or do I mean a selective, step-by-step war against terrorism? Because this involves, for example, the assumption that we must use force to overthrow Saddam Hussein. I have no necessary objection to using force to overthrow Saddam Hussein, but I don't think the issue has been canvassed sufficiently that I yet feel comfortable on either side of the question. With respect to the classic Middle East controversy, again I retreat to my principle of truth-telling. A great deal of nonsense gets talked about the Middle East conflict. And I am disappointed that the President has not yet seen fit to go back and, even at the risk of boring people, go back and revisit the origins of this conflict, which go at least back to 1947 and the partition plan produced by the United Nations for the disposition of what then remained of the Palestine Mandate territory, remembering that 75% of the Palestine Mandate territory had already been disposed of in the form of the Hashemite Kingdom of Transjordan. Most people, and most Americans, I suspect, are quite unaware of the fact that Jordan was created by drawing lines on a map as a way of finding a safe haven for the then Sharif of Mecca, who was being kicked out of Saudi Arabia by the Saud family. And they found a place for Abdullah by creating the great Hashemite kingdom, which had absolutely no provenance. There was never any background. There had never been a Hashemite kingdom. The Hashemites bore no relationship to the Palestine Mandate. The Abdullah, the then leader of the Hashemite tribe, was, as I say, a Saudi from Mecca, and I don't think he'd ever set foot in the territory of what is now called Jordan. You have to go back to the UN partition plan. You have to go back to the fact that at the moment that the Israelis declared their own independence under the terms of that plan, every Arab country went to war with them. And that all of these borders we speak of, with the exception of the border with Egypt, and, as it happens, the border with Jordan, all of them are truce lines. They are truce lines that go all the way back to 1947, and then 1953, and then 1956, and then 1967, and then 1973, and on, and the Arabs, bless their souls. I don't know why I should. I mean, now that we've been told authoritatively that Peter is going to be in charge of the disposition of all good Muslims, which I'm sure comes as an enormous surprise to all of the imams and the ayatollahs. The Arabs have always made the mistake of losing all of these wars. Now, when you lose wars, it is frequently the case that land passes from one hand to another. Israel begged Jordan not to enter the 1967 so-called Six-Day War. Begged them to do so. They stayed out of that war for the first 3 days. They stupidly entered that war on the 4th day, were clobbered on the 6th day. That's why we have the so-called West Bank. That's why we have the unification of Jerusalem. That's why we have the so-called occupied territories. All of those territories had been occupied by Jordan. They lost the war, and they stopped occupying those territories. And even though there has been an agreement with respect to the river borderline between Israel and Jordan, there has never been a final resolution of that conflict, which is, again, a reason why you have occupied territories. It is not the slightest bit illegal for Israel to occupy the occupied territories, any more than it was illegal for the United States to occupy Japan and its sector of Germany at the conclusion of the Second World War. The Arabs remind me of, let us say, Adolf Hitler, who might have come to us in April of 1945 and said, you know, I've been looking back over the record, and I think I made a terrible mistake in going to war with all you guys. So let's call off the war. But I want Czechoslovakia. Now, it does not seem to me that the loser of a war has the privilege of deciding whether or not I'm going to keep Czechoslovakia, or, in the case of the Arabs, whether they're going to keep the West Bank. The West Bank doesn't belong to them. The West Bank doesn't belong to anybody. Israel, in its original Declaration of Independence, did not include the West Bank because Israel was scrupulous in obeying the partition plan laid down at the United Nations. This was the famous plan that our great representative, Ralph Bunche, in which he was centrally engaged and centrally involved. I wish that an American president would go back over this kind of history and suggest we have a lot of issues that need to be resolved here. But the United States is not going to resolve them. If there is goodwill and desire to resolve for a resolution on the part of the parties, then we are here to facilitate in any way we can, bring the parties together, serve as honest brokers, middlemen, any useful function. But basically the parties have to want to agree. In the absence of such an agreement to agree, we aren't going to be able to resolve your differences, because that would mean our deciding these questions, and it is not for us to decide them. And it would be for us then to implement and monitor the implementation forever and ever and ever. And we are not prepared to take that on. If you can't stop killing each other, we're sorry. With respect to the immediate question, I'm even sorrier because my understanding of George Bush's statements in mid-September of last year was such that I do not conceive of how a rational person could have excluded the terror which is being waged against Israel on a daily basis and has been for the past 20, 30 years. If that is not a part of the nexus of terror, then I guess I missed something in the definition. So with respect to the immediate question, it is not a matter of, well, we'll stop killing you if you'll stop doing something else. No, 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 no. No, you just stop killing people. Now, if you do that, then everything is open and on the table. But the giving of something as a reward for stopping doing something that you shouldn't have done in the first place is a kind of algebra that eludes me somehow. And yet that is the situation in which I think we have not found ourselves, we have sort of slipped into. This American president, it seems to me, does have an opportunity, because of the enormous support he will receive from an American people which is finally awake to the menace of terrorism. He could command a substantial popular consensus, but he can only do it on the basis of some truth-telling. And that step, it seems to me, has not yet been taken. It is not going to come out of UN deliberations. The UN does not come to this issue with clean hands. The members of the United Nations do not come to it with clean hands. Very few members of the United Nations come to this particular set of issues with clean hands. I'm not even sure that the United States does, but we certainly come closest of any of the major powers. And we have it in our capacity to have a profound influence, but it can't just take off from nowhere. It has to take off from a very solid grounding in what this fight has been about, at least since 1947. And of course, if you want me to go back to the Second Crusade, I will do that too. But I would prefer to find a somewhat easier cutoff point than the 11th century. Well, I have kept you beyond your breakfast time. Thank you very much, Morton, for having me over. I know you all came here just, particularly the gentlemen here, just to get a good breakfast that you didn't have to get your wife to make for you. But thank you for coming anyway, and it's been a very pleasant and an encouraging experience for me.